I am Nat, and I am the head of community at Exceptional Individuals. So we are a social enterprise, for those of you who do not know, who specialize in different ways of thinking. So dyslexia, dyspraxia, autism, ADHD, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, Tourette's, those, it's a long old list. And we deliver these webinars every single week, almost. And it's because it's something we care about. And we'd like to do a deep dive on a whole wide range of subjects to just make people, I suppose, passionate about thinking differently. 80% of our team are neurodiverse, so we are experts by experience, as well as some formal training just to polish it off. Now, today, we are going to be doing a book club on NeuroTribes, but do not worry if you've never read the book, because today is more about just making sure you get all the knowledge necessary, even if you haven't been able to read it. And if you have read it, it's always good to top up your knowledge and keep it fresh in the old noggin. Okay, so let's get to it. NeuroTribes. This is the legacy of autism and how to think smarter about people who think differently. Or it's the future of neurodiversity. It has different titles depending on if you're in Europe or in the US. So if you ever wondered why the book has multiple titles, it's for that reason. Now, I mentioned a bit about us, but this is our lovely team. We get involved in a lot of things. I won't go into too much detail today, but do check us out on exceptionalindividuals.com if you want to learn a bit more about us and find out what we're getting up to. And a real quick overview. The book NeuroTribes was written by Steve Silberman, and Steve's a really interesting guy because he's not autistic, but he had a really fond interest in it. He used to be a writer for Wired, and he did a lot of things on science, and he was just in a coffee shop one day, and he heard some parents of autistic children talk about this epidemic and how, everyone's getting it. And he was like, I don't know about that, but it's interesting, so I'm going to do some research on it. And he did an article called the, was it like nerd syndrome or the nerd gene? And it got really good reviews. So then he thought, there's a bit more in here. And that's when he started doing this book on autism and neurodiversity. Now, I'll be keen to know your opinion. Was he the right man for the job or person, considering he's not autistic? I personally think he's handled this book very respectfully, but it's still worth knowing. He did an interview a while back where he mentioned that he's gay, and if someone wrote a book about being gay who isn't gay, he wouldn't like that. So he's very aware of the potential criticisms of the book. He also talks about the book from a historical point of view, a scientific point of view, and an advocacy perspective. So he does try to cover the whole narrative. He won an award called the Sam Johnson Prize. I think they've changed the name of the prize now, but it's a very prestigious award. And I think it was the first science book that had won that award, which is a big feat. And it won lots of awards. So with that done, we're going to go on a quick bit of a quick quote, which I think sums up really nicely. So this was done by Francesca Happé. She's a cognitive neuroscientist. I think she's currently studying in King's College London, and she is very credible. And the fact that she said this was a beautifully written and thoughtfully crafted book, an historical tour of autism, richly populated with fascinating, engaging characters, and a rally call to respective difference. I wanted to put that there because, again, this person, he's not autistic. He doesn't have a degree in autism, yet he wrote one of the, I would say, definitive books on neurodiversity to date. And it's great to see that people who do have the academic background can also back up a lot of the work he has done. Now, by all means, I'm not getting paid to recommend this book, so we will be talking about the positives and the negatives. Michaela says, by being gay, he is aware of people who can be rude, so I think it would help him to be sensitive to other people who are different. That's a good way as well of looking at it. Trisha says, did the author gain narratives from people who are neurodiverse? Really good point. And yes, he did. He did a lot of research, and he spoke with a lot of people. One of them, for example, is the person that Rayman is based off of. He spoke with him. He spoke with, yeah, we'll be going into that, but he did a lot of research. So that does make it a bit better. Now, the book covers a wide range of subjects. Like I said, the book isn't just history, it's about the future. There's a lot of speculation as well in it. But I do find it's quite good because he at least draws you to the attention that it's not perfect. And the book is a bit biased. Do not consider this like a glossary of or like an exact history. It is very much a personal perspective that is backed up with historical records. He talks about different traits of autism and how they have run through history, because I'm sure you can imagine that autism isn't a new thing. It's always been around, but the names we use have continuously changed. And also the traits of what we consider autism have also been varied. Michaela says, I think it's fair play to him as he's bringing awareness to a group of people he is not included in, so he's doing this for other people and not himself. I like that. I think that's a good way of seeing it as well. He also talks about parent blaming. There's this thing called the refrigerator theory, which is basically if you've got a child with autism, you're a bad parent, and he calls people out on that. He talks about Rayman, you know, the great film with Dustin Hoffman, the pros and the cons of it. It was a film that did probably equally harm as it did good in the community, which I think is quite interesting. What is its lasting legacy? Well, we'll find out. And also about the movement. So when we talk about neurodiversity, we're normally talking about the movement, which is all about how we are changing the narrative and not just seeing it as a disability, but seeing it as something which is a different way of thinking that does have strengths. Now on to some lovely interaction, which I think makes this a lot more of an enjoyable process. First of all, have any of you actually read the book? Yes, multiple times, love it. Yes, once, to be honest, once is enough. It's a big old book. No, but it's on your reading list. Or no, I'm just here for a summary. And honestly, that's completely fine. No, okay, Jackie's just downloaded a copy. Brilliant. Do you know what? It is an intimidating book, and I'm not going to lie, it is a big book, but it actually does read really well. Like, I listened to it mostly via audiobook because I'm severely dyslexic, and I went back and forth between the two. And I do find you can dip in and out of it, but I was actually so engrossed in it that I kind of did it in near enough one sitting within a couple of weeks. But it's good to know that a lot of you haven't read it. And thankfully, this isn't like a book where I can spoil it, you know. It's like, it was Voldemort, you know, I can't spoil it. It's something where you'd gain value no matter if you already knew the context. I got the wrong book, NeuroTribes, The Legacy of Autism and the Future of Neurodiversity. No, you did not get the wrong book. It just has different titles. So don't worry, it's the exact same content inside. Yeah, they just, I don't know, publishers, Justina just started reading it. That same author, so hey, no, you do not have to worry. And Tina just got the audiobook. The audiobook's a good listen. I can't remember who reads it, but you know, some books, they're awful. But I think this audiobook, I found it very pleasant to listen to. I don't think Steve does it himself. But basically, the book has a couple of themes which are like rooted in everything they do. Because again, remember, it talks about a lot of subjects, but there has to be some glue that holds it together. And some of those are looking at the history of autism before autism was a recognized condition which you could be diagnosed with. So I want you to look at these three individuals. We've got Albert Einstein, the theory of relativity. We've got Sir Isaac Newton, who essentially not invented gravity, but, you know, acknowledged the gravitational constant, you know, with the apple falling on his head. And we've also got Charles Darwin, who is the father of evolution. Now, I would love to know it in the comments. Please let me know, is it okay to diagnose people retrospectively? To be honest, it's a difficult question because on one hand, Would we like Einstein to be part of the autistic massive? Definitely, because he's one of the smartest people to ever live. So he would be a massive addition to the cause. But if we're diagnosing people who we've got no evidence to suggest it, is it kind of counterproductive? Does it do more harm than good? A lot of these people were like diagnosed retrospectively through looking at like writing, documentation, or if they were alive today, would they be diagnosed? I don't know. I struggle with this question. And when you Google, for instance, people who have dyslexia or people who have autism, you are always going to get all these famous examples. But all I would say is take it with a massive pinch of salt, because there's a big difference between someone being diagnosed, resonating personally with being neurodiverse, and someone just putting that label on them without anything to back it up, apart from a few anecdotal statements. April says, I might have said this in a previous webinar, but I wrote a blog post that determined if Einstein was autistic, dyslexic, dyspraxic, or had ADHD. Yeah, April, that's really good. And I recommend you read that if you get a chance. It's really good. Tricia says, I guess it's unethical to diagnose without a professional diagnosis. I agree with you, Tricia, but I would also argue that due to how inaccessible it is to get a diagnosis, that's not always the best approach. So for instance, if you're from a lower socioeconomic background, maybe female, maybe from a BAME background, the chances of you getting diagnosed as an adult as well, really slim. So do we really want to like slice that off? But there is a difference, I suppose, between someone who's currently alive today to someone who has long since passed away. Sophia says, I saw Einstein's name used in a dyslexia campaign too. Do not listen to it. Einstein was an amazing person. He definitely had something going on under the hood, but give me some actual hardcore evidence that he was neurodiverse. I think the diagnosis process is unethical personally. Thanks, Patricia. Justina, self-identification is just as important. No, I am definitely saying self-identification is important, but these people didn't they didn't self-diagnose or self-identify. They were done later on. Louise says, I think it's bad to suppose diagnosis retrospectively. We only ever see it used positively at the moment, but theoretically it could open the doors to people also retrospectively diagnosing criminals, etc., and using it against us. Remember, every time there's a mass shooting in the US, the voices start, yeah, imagine if people started saying Hitler was autistic. I don't want that rep. It's not going to be good, Justina, but obviously diagnosing other people is a different matter. So it's a controversial subject, to be honest. There isn't a definitive answer, but definitely worth asking. Now, the next thing is Asperger's. So I'm guessing many of you will know this fella, but he was an Austrian scientist who did a lot of research on autism back during like the 30s and 20s. And he lost a whole heap of research. And the research essentially would have pushed the autism narrative and understanding like 20, 30 years ahead. What do you think would be different now if we had his research before it all went missing? We are going to touch the point to this person's controversial background, which relates to Nazis. But at the moment, we're mainly referring to his research, which did have merit. And when you might have heard of Asperger's syndrome or like condition, that wasn't actually created by him. Lorna Wing gave him that name as a like homage for his research. I don't think he particularly had a particular name, or it wasn't Asperger's, for example. But his research only got found, I think, in like early 90s or 80s. How would life be different? We got more people would have awareness of autism and Asperger's, absolutely, would be a little bit further in our understanding. Fewer suicides, sadly, probably true. People commit suicide because they can't understand how their mind works and it feels like the world is against them. But sometimes having that recognition, that kind of like, this is why you think the way you think, can really be beneficial. Louise says, my life would be very different. I was diagnosed at 8 when my parents first managed to get an ed psych involved instead of 45. Yeah, that would have made a massive difference. You know, getting diagnosed young, you can put all the things in place. As an adult, not so much. Just says, I've been through NHS and believe it's not easy even if they do pay for it, because they do also implement triage processes so that too many people don't get through it and it's cheaper for them. Michaela, boo! I remember the webinar you did on him. Yes, do check it out. We've got it on YouTube if any of you are curious about this fella's controversial history. So we would be able to understand ourselves better and not be fighting our minds, definitely lower suicides and self-harming and mental health. Yeah. So, and the thing is, his research was always around. No one just bothered looking through the files because he had this big institute in Vienna and it got bombed and people just assumed it was lost forever, but it was still around. And the book also talks about genetics. So is it nature v nurture? Now, we've kind of known there's been a link between genetics for a very, very long time. But if you ask some of the pioneers of autism, like Leo Craner, who we'll go on to a bit in a moment, he was very much under the impression that it's more related to nurture than nature. So how your parents raise you. But genetics has always been a thing. The sad truth is that people get missed for diagnosis year in, year out. And maybe you'll find that your great-grandkid has autism. That means you very well may have it yourself, but you didn't get diagnosed, you didn't receive the same support. April says, my brother and I are autistic. Nice. Oh, yes, the Asperger's webinar were very interesting. Thank you. Martha says, you've mentioned a YouTube channel in a previous meeting. Please tell me where to find your previous sessions as soon as you're done with this presentation. Will do. April, if you're able to, would you able to post the link to our YouTube? Because it's definitely worth checking out. And the reason we also bring this up is that we now know that being autistic is hereditary, so it does run in the family. Now, let's say you have it. That doesn't mean your father or your mother definitely has it, but it does mean that maybe your grandparents does, because it can skip generations. And though we've known this for a while, we haven't always put as much evidence on it. Unfortunately, we made massive progress in the 20s and 30s around autism. And then after the war, we went down massively. And it's like we went backwards in the amount of research. We started looking at refrigerator mother, bad parenting, drugs, birth defects. So when we think, it's always getting better all the time, it's not. And it's why keeping documentation of research and passing on knowledge is so, so crucial. April has very kindly put it in the chat. Don't watch it now, but afterwards, do check it out. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Another key learning we've learned from NeuroTribes is that autism tends to have a link to intelligence in the family. And this is, again, an interesting thing because for so long it was related to learning difficulties, challenges, deficits. And that's just not the narrative that Steve got from doing his research. A classic example for those of you in the UK is The Chase. So Anne Hegarty, who is the governess from The Chase, she has autism and she is really intelligent. Her IQ is 137. So when we think of autism as relating to a lack of intelligence, the evidence just doesn't back that up. But there is a difference between how history has gone in different patterns. One researcher, Leo Craner, he didn't really see the intelligence side. He was very much under the impression that this is something which needs curing. But then Hans Asperger's, who did research at the same time, saw people with autism as little professors, geniuses. So again, this is nothing new that autism does have a relation to high intelligence. But it's not the full story, and we'll see that soon. Because just saying that some of us are really intelligent It was changing the narrative, which meant that certain people did not get the help they deserved, or even sterilized, which is really nasty. Sterilizing is when they make sure that people with disabilities were unable to have children, so they weren't continuing the gene pool. Really dark. But again, probably more information for another day.
I just want to say, I think people think with people with Asperger's, well, especially from a minority point of view, that we're not intelligent. Well, but I think it's not nothing to do with intelligence. I think it's the time it takes as a process of information. People get understanding that you're a bit slow and you're not as clever, you're not intelligent. That's why they think you don't, you're a bit thick and slow.
Yeah, you're totally right there. That people link the amount of time it takes you to process to your intelligence. No, just because it takes you a little bit longer doesn't mean that you don't have the intelligence. It's that your brain is busy putting it together.
Yeah.
But yeah, great point. Now, the other thing kind of I think Steve Silberman does particularly well in this book is he goes back to the basics of autism. It wasn't, the narrative of autism has changed a lot. And some of this might be common knowledge to a lot of you, but it hasn't always been the way it is. So, for instance, Leo Craner, who we're going to be talking about more today, he is known in the Western world as like the father of autism. But there was also autistic research being happening at the same time elsewhere, such as Hans Asperger. Now, there is a bit of controversy. Was there some plagiarism involved? And if you actually, when you read this book, you'll realize that Steve doesn't particularly like Leo Craner that much. He's actually quite critical of a lot of his research and essentially goes as far to call out Craner as a plagiarizing, or at least kind of taking a lot of Hans' research, which was in German at the time and wasn't widely known about. Whether or not that's true, it's a bit hard to say, but they did go in very different directions. One of them saw autism as a very junior, like child condition, which affects intelligence. And the other one saw it as a potential gift with lots of strengths attached to it, but also saw that there was the other side of the spectrum, which they deemed as kind of worthless. So I'm not trying to say one of these people is better or worse, but they had different ways of viewing what we now see as the same condition. And to understand why their views were so different, we have to go back to the history a little bit. So on here, Hans Asperger's or Leo Craner, who essentially are the fathers of autism, which one was Jewish? So yeah, we've got, it was Craner. And why does someone religion have anything to do with this? Well, it does change kind of the background and the views that you have to take into consideration. So for instance, the fact that Asperger's was not Jewish during the time of Hitler and the Nazi regime meant that he would be less praised, for instance, for talking about genetic diversity as a strength, or at least a strength from the whole spectrum. So religion did have a big part to play. It also might kind of mean that, say if Craner did steal from Asperger's, probably because he didn't like his views, why would he want to give credit to a Nazi sympathizer, someone who is sympathetic to the Nazi regime, to someone who in some ways actively opposes his types of views and beliefs? The book doesn't go as far to say whether or not he did steal or their personal views to each other, but it would be very unlikely that two people who lived at the exact same time doing the exact same research didn't know about each other. Obviously, it is possible, but it's an interesting question. And if you look at if you read other books on autism, there are a lot more understanding towards Craner, where NeuroTribes is probably a little bit more critical than most. And that's actually one of its biggest criticisms. The next one on Asperger's v. Craner, autism were not intelligent, but merely saying what their parents wanted to hear. So again, we talked about intelligence. Are autistic people intelligent, or are they just good at repeating? So who said that? It was, 50-50. If anyone can push it over the edge. It is, in fact, Craner. So Craner, who a lot of people see far more favorably in the autism community, did say that a lot of people with autism aren't intelligent and that they're merely kind of parrots. They're good at echoing or repeating what others say, where Asperger's was far more like, he says, no, they are really intelligent. They're great people. And you can kind of see where Lorna Wing, who then goes on to take Asperger's name and kind of coins Asperger's syndrome, started to like really pioneer his work. Because on the surface, this is a guy who's changing the narrative. Suddenly, autism is a good thing. And actually, they're intelligent and they have lots of amazing gifts and talent. And it was only until a few years ago, long after Lorna Wing coined Asperger's syndrome, that we started to realize that, yeah, it was true that Asperger's did look at autism in a nicer light, but he also had strong links with the Nazi regime, and he also euthanized people who he considered to be on the low functioning side of autism. So, you've always got to take history from like a complete perspective, because if you only look at one little chunk, it changes the narrative quite dramatically on who we view as the good or the bad person. And I think with the history of autism, it's not as simple as good v bad. I think it's knowing that each individual contributed in their own way, but also in today's lens is very much a flawed person. Okay, the next one is, was this Asperger's or Craner? Noticed that their patients did not care about authority or enjoyed learning rather than pleasing teachers. Yep, it was, I think, Asperger's. So he did a lot of studies on how people noticed, and it kind of goes back. I mean, it sounds like he was doing great research, but the conditions weren't great. And let's say you didn't exactly perform to the way that he wanted you to, then you were going off to a euthanasia camp. So great research. And back to our original question, what would life be like if that research was found a lot sooner? Life would be better, undeniably, I'm certain of it. But that doesn't mean that the way we got to that research was the most ethical process to begin with. And I think the last one is on Asperger's v. Craner. Autistic children often had very intelligent parents. ... saw this as parents that were cold and unloving. This is a good way to find out if you were listening, but don't worry, it is anonymous. Yeah, it was Craner. So we, though there was evidence to support intelligence, Craner did not see that. He thought you were just copying, and if you were autistic, your parents were probably bad. They didn't love you enough. They were too stern. They were cold. They were unloving and selfish. And this was really, really damaging. So when people look today, like, why do people have all these negative views of autism? You can kind of thank this fella, because he created a legacy of people seeing it as a bad thing to be. So even if you were diagnosed, you may not talk about it publicly, or your parents may not want to find out, because knowing the truth would be a reflection upon them rather than something which they can use to get you the right help. Chilling, right? Now, a quick bit of a thing just to kind of get a feel of the room. Autistic behaviours are often misinterpreted, as we learned from these researchers, misinterpreting how people demonstrate their characteristics. Have you experienced any of the following just from people not really knowing you? Maybe being bullied, abused, kept out of full participation in society, fired from jobs.
To a window.
And this is, again, a really interesting thing to note, because the book does also go into detail about understanding that different individuals through history has interpreted the characteristics of autism through different lenses. Some saw us as mini geniuses. Others saw us as just repeating parrots, regurgitating information. And Some only saw us as males or white and didn't realize that we could be any color under the sun and all different genders. So depending on who did the research and what research we deem to be most noteworthy has really, really determined our understanding and the path that autism knowledge has taken. So at the moment, sadly, a lot of you have been bullied. To be honest, this isn't nice to see, but unfortunately, it's not surprising. Now, I'm actually surprised a lot of people we work with do get fired from jobs, and not so much institutionalized, but it used to be far, far common because there was this kind of narrative that if you had a disability or potential autism, that you weren't going to live a fulfilling life. So it was an act of mercy to institutionalize or even worse. Now, though that doesn't happen so much today, the trickle of history of seeing autism as a negative thing, as seeing it as bad parenting, probably has contributed to day-to-day bullying and abuse. So you can kind of see how it filters through. April says, I spent 3 nights in a psychiatric ward during a difficult time in my life. This is the closest thing to being institutionalized I could think of. And when I was younger, I was institutionalized for like a couple of weeks where they wanted to do studies on me. I was quite young, so I don't remember it too well, but I do remember being essentially locked up. And I didn't really understand why. And that was in the early 90s. So it still very much is a thing, even though if it's less common. The next part about the book is talking about the sheer size of the spectrum. We spoke about the history and how autism was going in different routes. So first of all, there was one route, then we learned about another route, and now we learned that it is a whole entire spectrum. So I want you, if you're able to, is just put a little pin on which kind of box that you feel you fit into the most. So we've got neurotypical, which is the green one. That is someone who thinks like the majority of the population. I'm not saying you have no individuality, but genuinely the way that the world was created does align with how you process. Then we've got like an alias, so someone who's non-autistic, but might have certain qualities or might be on the fringe of society. Then we've got neurodivergent, which are things that might not be exact autism, but, are in the same family. So dyslexia, ADHD, dyspraxia. And then we have autistic. So when we're trying to label people, typically we like to make it as clear cut as possible, but in real life, it doesn't work quite like that. And it is more of a spectrum. So you're not either like neurodiverse or neurotypical, on or off, yes or no, 1 or 0. It typically is kind of along the lines. And what these diagrams do not take into consideration is that it can fluctuate. So if you are neurodiverse, you are that for your entire life. But depending on certain situations, whether or not you're happy, sad, stressed, relaxed, how it presents itself can be very different. So you might, for instance, go in between categories depending on your current mind or space at the time. And again, I think NeuroTribes does a really good job of showing how different situations, they talk about historical figures like Cavendish, who was a scientist, and how in certain situations, he didn't show any characteristics, but when people review him in a personal setting, they would notice that there'd be something that didn't quite align. So a question I want to ask all of you is that not all characteristics of autism are bad. What positive autistic traits have been seen as bad? So this is a bit more a complicated question than just what good traits are there, but are there traits which in the past have been seen as negative, but actually are not negative, in your opinion?
Well, I'd say negative is some people with Asperger's don't seem to they can't make friends with their same age, people on the same age as them. They tend to play with children who are 8-year-olds, 10-year-olds. I mean, you could be a 40-year-old, but you will stand out, and it makes you feel a bit odd, I think, I suppose. Someone who associates with an 8, 9-year-old.
Yeah, no, I definitely noticed that. It's quite common that people might not bond with their own age range and find more in common with either younger or older. We've also got things like honesty and truthfulness. Again, I'm sure a lot of us have been in trouble in the past through being too honest, but in many ways, there's a massive strength attached to that. Urge to always have a plan. Yeah. Perfectionism, great stuff. So depending on where we are in society and people's views and values and history and context, there are different things on what we consider good or bad. Justina says, I'm not sure I would agree with the idea that you may be autistic or neurological. Can you explain upon that a little bit further? But please do call me out. If there's any things that you think I'm not so sure about. Today, I'm mainly giving the views of what I took from the book, but always happy to lend an opinion if it seems right.
I just accidentally pressed send before I finished typing my sentence. So what I was trying to say is that I don't think I agree with the idea of being that sometimes you can be autistic and sometimes you can be neurotypical, because there's the big issue of masking that comes in. So
yeah,
you're always autistic. Autism is your neurology, so you always autistic. But some people may mask it, and I think that's, that is something that is very, well documented when it comes to diagnosing, for instance, girls and women who have like you cannot acquire autism. You're born with it.
I completely agree with you. I think what I was trying to say is that your characteristics can fluctuate depending on your mood or situations. So you are always autistic, but some days, for instance, you might find things more stressful than other days. And you said about masking. So there is also masking to take in consideration.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm definitely not saying that it's something you can kind of gain or lose. You've got it through life, but you might be in a situation where you've learned to cope in a way you're okay with. Michaela says, I like to ask questions about things I don't know, but I'm told that sometimes it's inappropriate. I'm not asking to be rude. I'm asking for knowledge or understanding. Yep, I'm totally with you on that. Louise says, I've been told I'm patronizing a couple of times. I've gone to the trouble of explaining things clearly with detail in the way that I would personally like them explained. Yeah. And you know what? Sometimes people want our skill set or our unique benefits, but other times they're not willing to find reasonable adjustments for the things that they might not find as favorable in certain moments. On this one, nice and simple question to all of you. Rather than focusing autistics to act normal, society should learn to understand and accept autistics. Do you agree or disagree? So in the basics, should autistic people learn to fit in with society because that's how life is? Or should society learn to understand how we think?
I think how we think, because we are seen as the weak point, as the weak aspect of things, and I think they should try and understand us, because we are a minority as opposed to the population as a whole, which is classed as a norm. So they should try to understand us rather than we fit in their boots and act normal and pretend to put a mask on.
I agree with you, though I would kind of add upon that, though I think society has to adapt and learn more about different ways of thinking, I also think that we do have a duty to at least learn as well. It has to be on both sides. Because if it's all one side, then I think people get quite resentful. But in the long term, absolutely agree.
I think, though, the problem is that up until now, it's always been people who are autistic that had to kind of, I know what you're trying to say. So what you mean that it needs to be sort of like a balance, but I think at the moment there's just such an importance for society to accept autistic people, because the level of knowledge and the level of awareness that people have is just minute. So I think yeah, it is really really important that people do learn and people do accept that we're all different.
No, I do agree with you. There is a time for a more balanced approach, but history has been rather unfavorable to us for so long. I think it is time for the other side to pick up the slack. Now, just to do a quick summary on the recurring themes of NeuroTribes, I've just covered a few points in a bit of a detail to give you a taste of what you can expect, but there are a few things which are quite useful. Now, I apologize for the amount of writing on this. I don't normally like to do this, but these are quite important points. So we know that autistics invent great things. So the book covers a lot of detail about how great people who were suspected or known to be autistic went on to create things, such as like the ham radio. The fact that Asperger's discoveries in the 1940s were lost has seriously harmed the lives of autistics, especially adults. So it also goes into about how we are so far behind, even though this stuff isn't particularly groundbreaking. It also talks about genetics quite a lot, about the link to intelligence, which again is quite a new concept, or at least in public knowledge. Autism has always existed across the spectrum, but wasn't widely recognized until recently. It used to be like 1 in a million, then it was like 1 in 100,000, 1 in a blah, blah, blah. And now people think autism is about like 1 in 50, and it could still even go up more. So that is continuously changing. Many autistic researchers interpret the same behavior and traits in different ways. Really important, because we talked about this in a historical context, but that happens even today. If you were to see two people who are able to diagnose, one of them might say you're autistic and another one may say you are not, depending on their own underlying beliefs, even if it's not so conscious. I guess that what I'm trying to say there is, if you are certain, then seek a second opinion. Autistic behaviors might be misinterpreted again and again. This explains a lot why women normally go underdiagnosed. The spectrum is diverse, so though we use one diagnosis to rule them all, ASD, we all are very different in how we present. Sometimes we find, and I think Steve mentioned this in one of his interviews, that people who have, say, over autistic children sometimes can be the worst culprits of this, because when they think of autism, they think of the example closest to them, and then they think other people that do not show similar characteristics to their kids are then not autistic. Just because you know someone who is autistic or you are autistic yourself, that does not make you an expert in the condition. It makes you an expert in your own individual understanding of it. We also learned that autism doesn't have to be bad. It's a very wide range of characteristics that have pros and cons. And the last one is that rather than focusing on autistics to act normal, society should learn to understand and accept, which I think a lot of you did agree upon. Oh, Wesley has says, agreed that it should be a balance of both sides trying to understand each other. But sometimes noteworthy is the fact that autistics have actually learned the neurotypical way of communicating and doing things due to our need to survive in the world, more vice versa. We autistics have to put in a lot more effort in understanding neurotypical society more than vice versa. That's a really good point. Essentially what I got from that, Wesley, is that yes, it takes both sides, but one side has to put in a lot more energy, because essentially we're continuously having to convert the language. So maybe the other side can put in a bit more effort. Now, there's a few kind of like tropes and takeaways which I gained from this book, and I would love to know, once you've had a chance to read it or listen to it, to let me know if you got anything different from it. So quickly, just your opinions from what you've heard. Cold parenting was blamed for autism. Gradually, it became obvious that this wasn't true. Have you ever felt stigmatized for having an autistic child? Now, I'm guessing not all of you are going to have autistic children, but if you do, has this been a thing? And remember,
I'll say I haven't got any children, but my parents do feel stigmatized, because my dad is a highly intelligent guy, and he thinks that why he's got children who are autistic and a bit different. And he just can't get his head around why, because he's not like, he's a very intelligent guy. And it makes me think why are we a bit different in the way we are, and why we're not classed as a normal like everybody else is. Because in our ethnic minority population, as you know, it's not very easily understood what Asperger's is, so it's very hard for him to understand why we are the way we are.
Yeah, no, I think that's spot on. The next thing, and I think we can obviously blame Leo Craner a bit for that with their refrigerator theory, which we know to be not true. But as we learn, mud sticks. So even if we've now learned something different and we learned that previous knowledge was fake or false, that, you know, it still sticks in people's minds. Another question I want to ask is that some view autism as intelligent and eccentricity that are so extreme that they become debilitated. Do you think this is true or not true? The trope here is blessed with suck. So there's this really good example of King Midas, who had this golden touch, right? So everything he touched turned to gold. That's amazing. But then he tried to eat food and it kept turning to gold, and eventually it killed him. So what it's saying here is that autism has a lot of strengths, but unfortunately they can cause challenges which are so extreme that those benefits can't be truly utilized. This one, I think, is very much a bit, you know, personal opinion, and I see agree, disagree. It's kind of like either side, but interesting thought nevertheless, which the book does touch upon. The next quick question I want to get from all of you is Rayman. Was it good for the community? Was it negative for the community? So Rayman was based on Kim Peeks and 2 other autistic men. Hoffman spent time with them, but was Rayman good or bad? Interestingly, most of you have put somewhat for some of us, and I think that's really true. For those who are more like savant, who has like really extreme skills in a particular area, it's been great. But it's also has put a lot of negative expectations on some of us. If I tell people I'm autistic, they'll want me to like recite the alphabet backwards, standing on my toes, or they'll ask for some like really unique skill set. I don't have that skill set. So unintentionally, by raising some people up on this pedestal, which hardly any of us get to go on, it can make the rest of us take a bit of a hit. On the other hand, though, this was the first time an autistic character was represented on TV as the main person. So it was a founding moment in the history of it. And this one is simply just rating on what do you think is the most severe form of autism? Because when there's this massive, like there was a pandemic and everyone was like, oh no, autism, which we now know there wasn't a pandemic, they started kind of like pigeonholing different forms of autism or different ways it presented itself with different names. And in some ways that had a lot of pluses. It meant more people were getting diagnosed, more people were talking about it. Where Craner's classic autism got kind of stigmatized, other autisms like Asperger's was seen as a good form of autism. So there was pros to it. The downside, though, was that it became really difficult to diagnose people because you had to fit in one of those boxes, and that's why they kind of changed it. If you've not heard of some of these, do not worry, they're not used anymore, but some people will still like refer to them. On this one, essentially, to prevent the Nazis from exterminating people with ASD, Asperger's hid the truth, only showing the most promising cases. So this goes back to, was Asperger actually helping people with autism by only showing the strengths of it? Or was he unfortunately with, I don't know what I'd say, but not in great kind of viewpoints? Okay, true. This one, I think NeuroTribes would argue that is not the case. This is what history kind of has been telling us, that Asperger was a good guy and he was actually trying to protect people with autism. Unfortunately, the research doesn't align with this. Check out our previous webinar on the controversial history of Asperger's, but yeah, it's the facts do not add up. In a quick review, My final thoughts on should you or should you not bother with this book? Absolutely. I thought it was a phenomenal book and I gained a great understanding. Did it bother me or not that Silberman was not autistic? Not really. I think he came across very empathetic, and I think it meant that he had more of a drive to get the facts absolutely right. So the reasons to read this is that it's a near encyclopedia depth of autism research. If you think you know autism, there's definitely going to be a few gems in here, more than a few, of things that you've never known before. He did an exceptional level of research. Also, the book is very character focused, so it's not a dry read. You get to learn about characters, you get to kind of explore in their psyche, and I think it makes it more enjoyable. Rather than learning about autistic from like the other perspective, he really dives in deep of it, and you feel like you're on the ground talking with these individuals. The downside to that, I'd say sometimes he makes a lot of assumptions. So when he's talking about historical characters, he is taking a lot of liberties, but take that as you will. He's also very strength-based. So if you're bored of hearing about how bad it is, he also does talk about the strengths. But that doesn't mean that he completely disregards the difficulties as well. It's in an audiobook, which I highly recommend. I really enjoyed it on Audible. You can get a free trial, and it was a pleasure to listen to. Nice narration. Now, there aren't many reasons why you shouldn't read this, but one of them is the historical figures. I think the book doesn't explain it well enough that this is mere speculation. And I think some people might misinterpret it and then go on and spread fake facts. It's also an incredibly big book. When I looked at this was really scary. That's why having the audiobook for me was absolutely crucial. There are also kind of things which help break down the books in different chapters online. And the last criticism is that some people argued that he misrepresents Leo Craner as a bit of a negative character, which, again, not all the evidence backs up. So though this book is an encyclopedia in many ways, and it is very fact-based, it is still, at the end of the day, an opinion piece. So do take that into consideration. But I really hope you found that interesting and thought, you know what? If I wasn't 100% convinced whether or not I should read it, now you're wanting to, or at very least, you've learned some of the key takeaways. Now, as I said before, we deliver these every single week, and next week is Autism in 40s. And we wanted to do this one because we often talk about being diagnosed as a child or like in younger life, but for people who are diagnosed in 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, autism can have a very different impact on either your mental health, on the changes that your body are going through, and a whole wide variety. Now, I will be co-delivering this, but obviously I'm not over 40. So my colleague Yosoda, who is also an expert in neurodiversity, is kindly going to be joining me and taking us through this really interesting journey. So for a first time and ever, we're going to be having a special guest, which I'm really excited about. So do have to check this out. And the very last thing is to get in contact with us. If I've said anything today and you're like, Nat, I would love to know a little bit more. I would love to see how we can work together. Get in contact. My name's Nat, N-A-T, Nat at exceptionalindividuals.com. And wow, that was a lot and quite a heavy session, but I really hope you were all able to gain something from it.
Nat, can I just say something? Just a quick feedback, which is very important to me. The way you provide information, and I really appreciate that you have open space for different views. And in some groups, regarding autism or ADHD, I struggle with like black and white options. There is only one way. So I really appreciate the way you accept other views and you're open to it. Thank you for that.
Well, no, thanks, Anna. I really appreciate that. And I'm always open for any of you challenging me on my points. Ultimately, autism and neurodiversity it's a bit ambiguous in a lot of places. So we have to make, it's up to you at the end of the day what view you choose to go with. But thanks again for everyone who attending. And it was really great to see some new faces. And hopefully I'll catch you again at the next one. So bye. Bye, everyone.